So what really caused World War I? Well, in short, it was a diplomatic failure that turned a localized conflict into a global war. But there were underlying long-term causes that made war almost inevitable. So let's explore those first. There were four main long-term causes: nationalism, imperialism, militarism, and alliances. Nationalism was a big one. European countries were extremely nationalistic during this period. They believed that their nation was superior to others and had the right to dominate others. This was especially true of Germany and Great Britain. Both saw themselves as having a special place in Europe, and both went to great lengths to assert their dominance. Another long-term cause was imperialism. European powers were all competing with each other for colonies around the world. This created a lot of tension because each power felt that they had to have more colonies than the others. Germany in particular felt that they were being left out of the colonial scramble, and this made them very angry. Militarism was also a big cause. All of the major powers were building up their militaries at this time. This created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear. Each power felt that they had to be prepared to defend themselves against the others, and this arms race would eventually contribute to the outbreak of war. Finally, there were alliances. All of the major powers were allied with each other in one way or another. This meant that if one power went to war, then the others would be dragged in. In particular, there were two main alliances: the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. The Triple Entente was made up of France, Russia, and Great Britain. The Triple Alliance was made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. So those were the long-term causes of the war. But what actually triggered the war? What pushed it over the edge? Well, that was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria on June 28, 1914. Ferdinand was visiting Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia. He was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. Now, this wouldn't have been a problem, except for the fact that Austria-Hungary was already on edge. They were facing a lot of internal problems. Their empire was crumbling, and they were being threatened by a group of Serbian nationalists. They saw Serbia as a threat to their existence. And so when Ferdinand was assassinated, they decided to take action. They declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914. Now, diplomatically, this was a huge mistake. Austria-Hungary had just given Germany an ultimatum. They told Germany that if they didn't support them in this war, then they would be considered an enemy. Now, this is basically the equivalent of giving someone a choice between two evils. And Germany had no choice but to support Austria unconditionally. They were tied to the Antwerp Cordial. And so when Austria went to war, Germany had no choice but to follow them into the conflict. The French and the Russians felt obligated to defend Serbia. The British, however, did not. They had no obligations to defend Serbia, but they had obligations to defend Belgium and the Netherlands. And they were also tied to the Antwerp Cordial, and so they felt obligated to at least consider the possibility of defending them. So what happens next is that all of these countries start mobilizing for war. The French and the Russians were mobilizing to defend Serbia. The Germans were mobilizing to defend Belgium. The British were mobilizing to defend their empire. And in this atmosphere of mass mobilization, nobody thought that diplomacy was possible. The French and the Germans were exchanging ultimatums. The Russians were making threats. The British were preparing for war. And so, in this atmosphere of hostility and aggression, the diplomatic situation rapidly deteriorated, and it became clear that war was inevitable. And that's what caused World War I. Now that we've explored the real causes of the war, let's debunk some common myths. Many people believe that the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand was the only cause of the war. That couldn't be further from the truth. Ferdinand's death was simply the trigger that started the war. The real causes were the long-term tensions that we discussed earlier. Others blamed the war on a single country. Again, this is wrong. The war was the result of a complex interplay of factors. No single country is to blame for the war. Finally, many people believe that the war was caused by a lack of communication. Again, this is not true. There were plenty of opportunities for the countries to communicate and avoid war, but they chose not to. The leaders of the countries were unwilling to compromise. They were too aggressive and too committed to their own national interests. And so, they chose war over diplomacy.